Can you hear me? Can you thumbs up? Okay, cool. All right. I haven't been pro in like so long. It's kind of weird to start. Um, all right, so I'm just going to start with some definitions. Wealthy, according to the Human Development Index, is the definition that I'm going to use, which takes into account the size of the economy, level of development, GDP, etc. I think that this is a more accurate measure of wealth than, for example, something like per capita GDP, which tends to boost really small countries. But I'm open to discussing those really small countries as well. But I think it makes more sense to use wealthy to mean like larger countries with a larger economy rather than a high per capita GDP. But I'm open to discussing that. Okay, so developing are those that are lower on the Human Development Index. So just for example, these are some that are in different parts of the world, countries like Bangladesh, Senegal, or Haiti. Development assistance, that's to support the economic, environmental, social, political development of developing countries in the long term. An obligation, I'm going to define this here as a moral obligation because clearly I don't think that there is like any legal obligation, which was the other part of the definition. So I see you nodding, so I think that's probably pretty cool. Okay, so my criterion for judging this debate, if I can show that it's morally correct for wealthy nations to provide aid, then pro should win. My first point is that most of the less developed countries are so because of a history of exploitation by the rich countries. This argument can kind of be summed up as rich countries are usually rich because they've done bad things to get that way. I would challenge my opponent to present some examples of a large economy, developed, wealthy nation without a past of exploiting either people or natural resources. Countries that have huge globalized economies usually got that way either from stealing from other people or from a natural resource reserve that everyone on Earth has to bear the consequence of burning through via climate change. And part of morality is making sure that other people don't bear the brunt of your selfishness, which leads me to providing development. The damage caused by developing an industrial economy can be mitigated. For example, providing startup funds for local entrepreneurs in Ghana or the Ivory Coast. The vast potential for solar power in these areas can be tapped instead of the future where everyone uses a gas-powered generator. And finally, countries high on the Human Development Index can often meet the needs that the less developed countries don't prioritize, but are nevertheless very important. And one particular example of this is family planning, specifically international aid for it given by the US government. A recent study found that fully investing in contraceptive services and prenatal care would dramatically reduce maternal deaths in poor nations by 3/4. And newborn deaths from 2.7 million to 541,000. So I can't really think of anything that's a more pressing moral obligation than saving the lives of mothers and children. In short, I think that these are three good reasons why the moral thing to do is to help the less developed countries.
Okay, so yeah, glad to have you here. Thanks for having me out for the debate. I do apologize in advance because I'm a little bit sick, and despite it being rescheduled multiple times, I did not actually have that much time to prepare for it because I've been very busy with work. But I'll jump right into it anyway. I agree with your definitions to a point. Your definition of a wealthy nation, of developmental assistance, government foreign aid, I agree with those. I agree that it's a moral obligation we're speaking about. However, I disagree with one point of the burdens that you presented. You said that you have to demonstrate it is morally correct. No, according to this debate, you have to demonstrate that it is morally obligatory, in other words, morally necessary. So it might be morally correct to do something, that does not mean it is morally necessary to do something. You state that wealthy nations are typically wealthy or well-developed because of a history of exploitation of lesser nations. And while that might be the case, I feel that you will have to demonstrate how this, which has always been the case in history, actually necessitates reparations. Like, the entire Earth has a history of conquest, of resource gathering, it's constantly a competition. Every aspect of life is competition in all facets of nature, and in human nature is no exception. So you'll have to demonstrate why that necessitates reparations instead of simply being the way history has played out. You then cited some studies showing how well-developed nations can positively impact lesser developed nations. And sure, that might be the case, but I posit that just about any kind of suffering you can find in a lesser developed nation, you can also find in those wealthy nations as well. And sort of the point that I'm going to make in this debate is that the moral obligation which human beings may have to assist one another and to better the living conditions does not necessarily extend to nations in the sense that nations must do that for outside nations. The purpose of a nation state is first to seek the well-being of its constituents, of its citizens. While suffering and injustice and economic imbalance exists within a nation, its first obligations are to its own constituents, its own citizens, before it extends that assistance to less fortunate nations around it. I will also be getting into later how foreign aid is not necessarily beneficial in the ways that it intends to be, and oftentimes can be harmful to the economies of developing countries. But for now, I will pass the mic back to you.
Okay, so I think that where we have a clash here is this idea between what is morally correct versus what is morally necessary. What you're trying to say is that I have to show that basically colonization or exploitation of resources does necessitate reparations. But I want to get a little bit more specifically there and kind of divide that point out. So in one instance, there's this idea of colonization, for example, and that is, I feel like, taking advantage of people by having a scaled up economy that people in other parts of the world, perhaps because of geography or maybe just not by being selfish, they didn't do that also. I don't think that that's true to say that every group or every country colonizes. That's just really not true. So you can look at the example for like the British Empire is one. They were able to do that. It gets kind of like a monopoly effect, right? Like if they have a significant advantage, then they can keep doing it and keep doing it, to the severe detriment to some of the countries that they've impacted. And I'll go into some further examples a little bit later. But the point I'm really making with all of this is that it does necessitate reparations because they are the ones that cause the problem. So if for example, if the UK or the British Empire drew the borders of a country, which is true in many different cases, the funniest one that I can think of is East and West Pakistan on the sides of India during partition, which is now Bangladesh. That if they are, it's something so fundamental as the borders of your country was drawn by some colonial power, I think that does necessitate some form of reparation, in that the person that made the problem needs to be the person fixing it, is kind of the rationale that I'm going on. Okay, so then we have this idea of the resources, that it's morally necessary if a country has become rich by extracting oil wealth, for example, or using resource wealth that the whole world is going to have to bear the cost of. And I don't really see that. Your main point really is something about going to inequality. If inequality exists within a nation, then we shouldn't address it outside of that nation. But there are plenty of these rich countries that don't have a high inequality index. The US definitely does have a high inequality score, but plenty of the others don't. Norway, for example, is a little bit better. Canada, some of the Nordic countries, Australia. Just to name some examples, the sufferings are not equal in less developed countries versus developed countries. Just to use maternal mortality as an example, this is from 2015. So in sub-Saharan Africa, it was 546 for every 100,000 births. And in the developed...
Okay, I see what you're getting at there. We run out of time. Okay, so I'm going to come back to couple of the things you said. You said that I did not address the resource use of wealthy nations and how the world sort of bears the cost of that. In order to address that, I'm kind of going to come back to something that I think you a little bit misunderstood me. When we spoke about colonization, I never said that every country colonizes. I said that it's simply historical fact that prosperous nations have been known to colonize. And I don't think that you've adequately demonstrated how the act of colonizing, the act of benefiting in economic competition, in perhaps even violent competition like warfare, I don't think that you've necessarily demonstrated that it necessitates reparation. It's simply historical fact. It happens. Prosperous nations, they have conquered economically, they've conquered militaristically, and it doesn't a priori necessitate reparations. I feel that you still need to demonstrate that. As for a colonizing nation defining the borders of another country. Well, I mean, borders are enforced by people who have the power to enforce them. So if you're a less developed country and someone comes in with, a militaristic force and they say, well, here's where our borders are, I still don't see where you necessitate for them to create reparations for that or for them to let you define their own borders. It's simply a historical fact, and it's simply a political fact that more powerful nations are going to have advantages. So that in and of itself addresses what you talked about the resource use that the world bears the cost of. Every action has a butterfly effect. The world bears the cost of everything you do. I mean, your neighbors bear the cost of, your poor health choices. If you're a smoker and you're obese, my tax dollars are going to go to pay your hospital bills in some sense. You're always going to bear the weight of what other people do, but that does not necessitate we're talking about a very specific thing here. Foreign aid is a very specific thing where a nation takes the tax dollars of its own citizens and gives it to a foreign government to help their citizens. And what I'm saying is that is not self-evident, that a nation has an obligation to do that. A nation first has an obligation to its own people. And you talked about how other wealthy countries, aside from the United States, don't have the same kind of inequality that we're talking about. Sure, they might not have the exact same kind of inequality, but they still have suffering. They still have homelessness. They still have people starving. They still have very real wrongs that could be righted here at home, where the same funds that are being sent overseas would be far more efficacious in doing so and actually result in a greater net reduction of human suffering if applied at home, which is the purpose of what a nation state is in place to do in the first place.
Okay, so you said greater net reduction in human suffering. I think that you're comparing things that are really just not comparable. So 546 deaths per 100,000 births versus 25, that's a significant difference. So when we're talking about something like you can spend $3 to help somebody get prenatal care in sub-Saharan Africa, and then that person might not have a child that to get prenatal care while they were pregnant, during the labor, etc. Right? It's such a small cost where the money can go a lot farther. And I think that you are actually morally obliged to help when it is less. It's not always giving it to the government. It's also giving it to an NGO, which is the case. That's why I'm kind of using this maternal mortality as an example, is because it's not money directly given to another government. It's usually used by a non-governmental organization that's working within communities there. In countries that are less developed. So then there's again this idea of I think you're using basically like a might makes right justification, where it's like, yeah, these countries got big and they can just kind of do what they want. Just to kind of use an analogy, so I have 2 young children. So when the older, bigger one takes a toy from the younger, less coordinated one, what do most parents usually say? Don't do that. That's not fair, right? Most parents don't usually say, it's fine, she's older and bigger, she can hit you and take your toys, I don't care. She's older and bigger, that's just how it goes, right? And so I think that kind of at our most base level, we do understand this idea of morality, that might makes right is not a good world for anybody to live in. And that's not something that people should really be proponents of. And I think that in saying, oh, you need to take care of your own first, yeah, fixing inequality is fine. But I do think that there is a moral obligation to help, where the money will go so much farther in another country that has such a less developed standard of living versus these wealthy countries. And I'm going to pass it to you to address that.
Okay, so I think we're having a bit of a clash of definitions here, because you're saying that foreign aid can also include wealth going to non-government organizations to help with things like prenatal care. I'm just going to pop over for Wikipedia for a second. I hope that's not too frowned upon here, because it gives a general overview. International aid, foreign assistance is defined in terms of international relations as money given voluntarily from one government to another for the development of its economy. So what we're talking about here in developmental assistance refers to that. What you're talking about donating to non-government organizations, that's charity. That's not foreign aid, and I'm all for charity. If you want to donate $3 of your own money to an NGO that's going to help someone get prenatal care, absolutely do it. That's fine. But that's very different from a government writing laws into effect to take portions of taxpayer money and give it to the governments of other countries, which is kind of what I wanted to get into here. According to Angus Deaton, a Nobel Prize winning economist at Princeton University who studied poverty in India and South Africa, by trying to help poor people in developing countries, the rich world may actually be engaging in behavior which corrupts those nations' governments and slows their growth. According to him, and quite a few economists who agree with him, much of the $135 billion that the world's most developed countries spent on official foreign aid, which is what we're talking about here, in 2014, may not have ended up helping the poor at all. According to a publication by Bill Easterly, an economist at New York University, demonstrating this very well in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, it actually showed an inverse proportional effect. As the level of foreign aid into Africa soared through the 1980s and 1990s, African economies were doing worse than ever. There's an inverse proportional effect here where the more aid that is given to a nation, it actually seems that the economic growth halts and decreases at exactly the same rate. A good example of this is, or a good example of why this might be happening, Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe since 1987, is well known to take foreign aid funding, which is meant for food and shelter for his citizens, and use it to reward institutions which support him and punish those which don't. It's common knowledge that subversive tactics and abuse of foreign aid this way is how he's been able to retain his presidency for 30 years. And he's very widely regarded. People use quotation marks around it when they say elections in Zimbabwe, because he's essentially a dictator, and he uses the funds which are given to his governmental institution, which is supposed to go to aid his citizens, and he uses it to advance his own political agenda. So aside from the moral obligation you might have to try to help other countries, it's kind of wishy-washy as to whether or not this even.
So that's good that you mentioned those countries, because that's exactly why in the 90s and early 2000s, the US government began giving the money to the NGOs instead of directly to the governments. So my definition that I used was development assistance is assistance given by a government to support the economic, environmental, social, and political development of developing countries. So that's money. I'm not talking about the recipient of the money being a government. What I'm specifically meaning is the giver of the money being a government. And so if the US government, until very recently, I think it was cut maybe just this past year, did give a significant amount of money for family planning services in all over the world, really. I think it's called the Global AIDS Initiative is another example of that, where the on the ground service providers are not the government of that country. Just from personal experience, I know a woman who started her own NGO working specifically in India, and she got a grant from the US government to go do that. So I think that that is specifically more what I'm talking about, rather than having the government be the provider of the services, because that certainly can be true. The provider of the services can be somebody who is an expert in providing those services, but the money comes from a wealthier country. It's not charity, it's the government that's giving the money. So I know I just want to address again this idea of the might makes right. And I think that that's really the kind of society that you're advocating for in all of this is the points that you've kind of brought up are the aid doesn't work. We should be able to take care of our own first. But many of these very wealthy nations, they have taken care of their own to such a high degree that they have universal health care, that they have free college, that they have very low poverty statistics. I think that you're maybe using the US as a model for what all wealthy nations are, which absolutely isn't the case, because the US actually has very stark inequality compared to a lot of other wealthy nations. Even so, the US has built its wealth on the backs of these poorer countries, and specifically on the backs of people that they don't pay to do it, that they stole from. That's just documented. And so I think that it's just kind of, it is a moral obligation, and that's really what we're talking about. It's a moral obligation to set things right. If you take something from somebody else, belong to everybody. There is a moral obligation to repair those damages. There's a moral obligation to either give it back, and if it can't be corrected in the sense where you can put it back the way that it was, then there's a moral obligation to repair the damage that you caused, whatever that might be. Just going back to the analogy of the two children, you don't tell the bigger one that it's fine because
Okay, so I'd like to clarify that I'm not exactly talking about might makes right, but when you get into geopolitics, you get into something a little bit more complex than children taking toys. Even going a step above that into the job market, like you're talking about children taking toys from each other. Okay, are you going to tell a job applicant who's better qualified and is more able to perform the duty that he's morally wrong for taking the job from somebody who might actually need it more? Like, this person might need the job more economically to support their family, but this person is a better qualified candidate, and he's going to do a better job. So are you going to tell him that he's morally wrong in taking the job? I just think that you're applying too simplistic of an analogy to something as complex as geopolitics, and I don't think that exactly stands. You insist that the United States and other wealthy nations have built their wealth on the backs of other nations and that it's just well documented. Well, I'd really like to see some citation for those documents, because my understanding was that the United States was an economic powerhouse, which actually, sort of became a hub for the rest of the world and sort of became a beacon of light, land of opportunity, where a lot of other people from different nations came to prosper. So I don't see that it necessarily did, build its wealth on the backs of these poorer nations. One might cite slavery, and, of course, I'm not going to, downplay the horrors of slavery in any case, but slavery has existed in every nation throughout the history of the world. And it was actually the United States that began moves to end the institution of slavery. And up until that point, slaves in the United States were treated better than slaves in any other nation throughout the history of any country in the world, basically ever. So I don't necessarily think that it's as self-evident as you're claiming, that these wealthy nations just necessarily are wealthy because they've, taken it off the backs of other countries. A lot of these nations are wealthy because they have natural resources. Saudi Arabia and these other oil states, they have massive, productions of oil and valuable resources that the rest of the world needs. The United States, it became a hub of industry and commerce, and that was, a large part of its prosperity. So it isn't necessarily that we've just taken it off the backs of everybody else and that we owe the rest of the world these reparations. And when I say we, I don't just mean the United States, I mean wealthy nations, well-developed nations as a whole. I feel what you're really failing to demonstrate, though, is how a nation state is obligated to spend its resources to aid suffering people in other nation states, when there are still suffering people in this nation state here, and the purpose of a nation state is the betterment of its constituents and citizens.
Okay, so a couple of things. I find it very hard to believe that you don't agree with me that the United States built its wealth on the backs of other nations, given that the United States stole the entirety of this continent from people who already lived here. And then when they made treaties with those people that already lived here, I just ordered a book about the Osage Nation, specifically that is in present-day Oklahoma, that I'm really excited to read about. In the review that I was recently reading about it, the treaties were drawn, then they were completely ignored by the U.S. government, redrawn. I think that this is something that happens all over the continental United States. Where I live in San Diego used to belong to Mexico. Before that, it used to belong to the Kumeyaay Nation. So yes, it was stolen. The United States isn't a rich powerhouse because it somehow has some kind of better system of government. It's because it stole things. And I think that you can't just say that kind of across the board. What if, like Saudi Arabia, true, it is sitting on a vast pile of natural resources, but what if Saudi Arabia, instead of being in Saudi Arabia, just by some accident of geography, happened instead to be in, where present-day Florida is? So it's not that my point there is that Saudi Arabia is not rich because it has a good government, because it's good at managing itself, because it's good at managing its resources. It has a good government because it got lucky by virtue of geography. as many nations do. And so those are kind of the two categories that I would put the rich nations in, the ones that got lucky by virtue of geography, or the ones that exploited other people to be able to get rich. And then there's also lots of overlap, I think, with those two. I think that a 30-minute debate isn't long enough to give specific examples, but I would also give maybe Norway as an example that has a vast resource wealth, but then also grew even richer during World War II with some other activities that weren't perhaps in the best interests of a lot of people. So kind of to get back down to it, I think that yes, if you have wealth, you are obligated to help people that don't have wealth, no matter where they are in the world. I think that that's perhaps just being a good person. I think that it's a moral obligation, especially when that development assistance costs the giving government such a small amount of money, when it can make such a big difference. Something like maternal health or prenatal care or HIV testing or just contraceptive use. Things that cost very, very little for a rich country that can make all the difference for somebody that lives in a poor one.
Okay, so a couple of things. You mentioned, again, colonialism. It seems to be a favorite of yours, that we sort of conquered this land from the Native Americans, and that all of America is founded on stealing land and conquering people. And sure, that's kind of true, but it goes back to what I was saying about historical precedent as well. The Native Americans were conquering each other and stealing land from different tribes and backing out of treaties with one another and completely screwing each other over in what were supposed to be beneficial agreements for centuries before we ever came over here and did it. The fact that we did it better, as harsh as that is to say, and as sad as that is to say, and as right as that might sound, does not mean that we were more wrong in doing that, or that our country as it exists today, with the people who inhabit it today, who are not responsible for that kind of behavior, even though they might benefit from it. It does not make what we have illegitimate. Okay. Otherwise, you'd have to correct for all of history back to the first caveman who ever killed his neighbor for a steak. Okay. And it just doesn't work that way. It simply doesn't. You mentioned that, Saudi Arabia, well, what if it was in Florida? They simply got geographically lucky to be where they are, to have vast amounts of resources. That's actually exactly what I said. I don't disagree with that at all, but that actually goes against your point and proves exactly what I said, that it is not necessarily that they stole it from anybody else. They got geographically lucky. They happened to be on a massive pool of natural resources, and that is where their wealth comes from, not necessarily that they stole it from anyone else. You say if you have wealth, you're obligated to share it. Yes, I agree, but who are you obligated to share it with is the question. If I have wealth, I am obligated to share it first with my family. I mean, there is a homeless man in New York who could really use a sandwich right now, but first I'm going to buy groceries for my household, for my wife and child. That is simply how it works. There is a priority of obligations. And to say that wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations, to affirm that stance, you are ignoring prior obligations which a nation, by virtue of the fact that it is a nation, has to its own citizens. I'll pass the mic back to you.
Okay, so that's true. I kind of just want to ask you a question. Do you think that Saudi Arabia has a good government?
No, but that is irrelevant to how they acquired their wealth and whether or not they owe the rest of the world for it.
So, because you were contending that countries that have vast wealth, you at one point you said something like it's because they were better at doing it. And so if you're willing to admit that a country like Saudi Arabia has in fact what most people would consider probably a terrible government, that they wouldn't be able to have that terrible government if they weren't rich. And so it's like the wealth giving them an excuse to kind of be terrible to their own people, which I think bears noting. So your other point was, who are you obligated to share it with? And I would say that kind of is that's going to be my ending point in this debate. Who you're obligated to share your wealth with is the person that needs it the most. So if you were walking down the street and you saw a mom and a baby that had no food, no home, it was freezing outside, they had no jacket, you had 2 jackets on and were getting into your warm car, would you keep both of your 2 jackets because you were also a little bit cold? I would really hope not. And I know that perhaps you'll say that this is an oversimplistic analogy, but we need to work to create the world that all of us want, that's good for all of us. And you need to share the wealth with the person who needs the most.
Okay, because that is the crux of your debate, I will ignore the rest of your tangential points, which I feel were actually kind of contradictory to your own. And I will simply end with what you stated. If I am walking down the street and I see a family that is cold and shivering, yes, I am obligated to, perhaps do something for them, but I am not going to take the jacket off of my child's back to give to another family that I don't know if I can't afford that. And we still have people suffering here.